Hello, this is Gonzalo Lira, and this is the Roundtable, Roundtable number 18. And I am joined by two people one of whom I've never actually interacted with before, but I've been meaning to, and finally he's arrived. And the other that I had a chance to talk to last week and is just a delight. I want to introduce Clifton Duncan. Clifton, how's it going?
It's going all right, Mr. Lira. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm here in Kharkov, Ukraine, and there's no air raid siren and no shelling going on yet.
That's always a good sign.
That's
it's going to be a good day.
Yeah, it's going to be a good day, And anyway, Clifton is an actor who rose to prominence not because of his work on Broadway, but rather because he refused to take the that magic medicine that everybody craves so much, but some strange people, oddly enough, don't want to, who are obviously enemies of the state. And so Clifton is an enemy of the state. So am I, and so is my other guest, Chris Martenson. Chris, how's it going?
It's going very well, all things considered. Can't wait to talk about what we're going to talk about here today.
Well, what we're going to talk about is the fact that we all are enemies of the state, because Emperor Palpatine gave his speech 2 nights ago, and he made it very clear what he thought of us, us evil people, because I'm a MAGA Republican enemy of the state who hates democracy and wants to, I don't know, do something horrible. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but anyway. What do you all think of that crazy ass speech?
Well, I'll tell you straight away. I could only get through half of it, and even then, and I always listen to Joe Biden at least 1.5 speed to make it bearable. and even still, I got through maybe about 10 minutes, and I had to stop and start because I was just so amazed at the things that were coming out of that man's mouth, and the biggest. Just the hubris that, this is not who we are. These people are the levels of projection, the levels of just the complete lack of self-awareness. We're supposed to pretend that the past, 6 years didn't happen. You people were the ones questioning the results of the election. You people were the ones who were looking the other way as billions in property damage and dozens of deaths unfolded over 2020. And yet you want to, hold yourselves aloft as people who don't resort to violence. Are you kidding me? There are so many things there that I said, this is just complete. It's insanity. It's like it's the whole. There's a whole I call them the blue cult. It's just so weird to watch.
Clifton, I so disagree with you because I was mesmerized by the background of the big building in shadows with the red lights. And I was like,
who did
yes,
that?
Emperor,
who did that?
We will destroy the rebels. Yes.
Well, Clifton, come on, you come from the theater. Somebody obviously had a theatrical sense to that. They had some flair.
Well, that's but that's the thing, Chris. It's like someone deliberately said, we're going to. And to be fair, the image going around, it was red, white, and red, white, and blue, but just the level of. It was so dramatically lit, deliberately, dramatically, theatrically lit. I said, whose idea was this to do this and to frame this way? It was so sinister. It's so sinister.
And by the way,
I love the symmetry, right?
Yeah.
And there were the 2 flags with the eagles at the top, sort of reflecting, I think, the Reich eagles. Plus, don't forget we had 2 Marines. When have you ever seen a president with military standing in the background at attention? I mean. And don't forget, because I'm cursed with a long memory. Do you remember,
yes,
the inauguration?
What you call it, funerals, state funerals. That's when they usually happen. When the former president dies, for instance. But I can't think of any other time.
The inauguration of this president was the first time we had chain link fences with razor wire and 20,000 armed guards, right? So they've clearly had this sort of military fascination with this idea that they're important or about to be attacked by somebody, even though they have, like Clifton said, they're the ones that have all the attacking pretty much on their side.
Well, it seems to me that Clifton's right because it's projection, and you think of that scenario, right? And basically what it's trying to show is strength. That's what it's trying to show. It's trying to show we are strong. But that, of course, is the sign of weakness because a truly strong man doesn't need to have that kind of paraphernalia.
Right.
Am I wrong?
No, it kind of reeked of desperation. And the setup for me was clearly this. They said, look, if you dared to question the election, you're an insurrectionist, right? Because that's what happened on January 6th. These people showed up who were daring to question the election, and that by de facto turned them into insurrectionists, which is now a weaponized term, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then after market, we saw Andrew McCabe, who the most disgraced human on the planet, somehow on CNN opining, saying, oh yeah, it goes further. We've had parents yelling at people at PTA meetings and school boards. This is like, they're terrorists, obviously. We've had people daring to question the sanctity of the FBI and the good people who work there, and that's troubling. So they're clearly setting this up to say, if you question the government at all, in any way, shape, or form, that's illegitimate. It makes you an insurrectionist, which I think is just them weakly saying there's going to be some weirdness going on this next election because we can't possibly win it on a fair and square basis.
Absolutely. Also, the thing is, see, whoever set up, just to round off the issue of the set decoration, right? First of all, Clifton, you would know this because of your theater work. I used to work in film. That kind of lighting setup is fairly sophisticated. It's not easy to pull off. You have to know more or less what you're doing. And so it was clearly deliberate. And my thinking is they wanted to run with the Dark Brandon meme. I mean, whoever set this up is into the whole meme stuff. And, that stupid leftist thing of like it's not leftism, because that's not true, because I know a lot of leftists who are horrified by this. We think it was outrageous. And it's just you cannot question us. And the thing is, see, starting in January 2021, it's been really since March of 2020 with the lockdowns. You cannot question us ever insofar as anything is concerned. If that's not anti-democratic, I don't know what is.
Yeah, it was very bizarre to see just even the idea of asking questions be completely undermined, even discouraged, even shunned and mocked. I said, whatever happened to the idea of a second opinion? It just completely left people's minds that we had, that we could exercise any sort of skepticism about what was going on. And that's, we keep batting around this idea of the mass formation, and and it's funny to see people talk about it. And I say, I've always said that one of the reasons that it caught on so much, I think, is just because finally people had like a term, they had a framework on which to hang what they like, just the completely absurd behaviors they've been observing over the past couple of years.
Yeah.
Yep. I agree.
I'm just, it goes against everything that is supposed to be democratic, and yet these people are slathering themselves as the defenders of democracy. And remember in 2021, that article in Time magazine, basically admitting to the fact that they manipulated the 2020 election proudly to fortify the democracy. I mean, that they're basically saying that they manipulated it. And so, Chris, your point of the November 2022 election, I have said on Twitter, and I'll say here, and I think I've said it in previous roundtables, that November 2022 election, the Democrats are going to hold the House and hold the Senate. It is going to be the most crooked election in history, because
it's going to be fortified. So this election has electrolytes. It's brand on.
No,
we're in a movie. I feel like I'm in a movie. I'm in a B-grade idiocracy level movie. Like this is so transparently evil, stupid, malicious, malignant, anti-democratic, the opposite of everything they say. That this iron law of projection is astonishing, and I find it offensive, right? It really actually bothers me when people go out and accuse me or other people of the things they that they do the most, right? It's really offensive. So you have leftist friends who maybe are starting to step away from this this little program.
Yeah, well, it's the harder left people, interestingly enough. It's the people who are not part of the democratic establishment. They're more like fringe lefties who have like, some of them are outright say that they are communist socialists and shit, but they're like, this isn't the America I grew up with. And they're not older people, because older people, I'm 54. And so, yeah, people my age were all horrified by this. But younger people who grew up with a completely different conception of what the United States was about are equally horrified. And it's just, it would be laughable if it weren't so serious, because these people wield real power. They can put troops on the street. They can take away your business, take away your freedom, lock you up forever if they want to. And nothing will stop them. Look what they're going to do to Julian Assange, for crying out loud. And Julian Assange is an Australian citizen who's never set foot in the United States and never committed any crime in the United States. And they're going to snatch him and put him in some deep, dark hole for the rest of his life, and nothing that can be done about it.
Yep.
Yeah, there's it's been really insane to see the way that people have conducted themselves. And I think one thing that's been really disturbing for me is to see that it's just so brazen. And it's one of the reasons that I go back and forth. And Chris, I'm actually really curious about your opinions on this and how your thinking has evolved on this. But, on one hand, and I've gone down the rabbit holes of, there is this cabal of people who is controlling things. I think the sort of moderate approach is saying, like, well, people are pursuing people in certain positions of power and influence and status are exercising their own self-interests for monetary, maybe other reasons. Doesn't have to be a huge, big, conspiracy, so to speak. But then there's a part of me that's like, maybe they're just that fucking dumb. And they're just this incompetent and this inept. And this is why we're seeing all these things. But it's just that so many things are falling apart in so many places at the very same time that it's hard to say. It's so hard for me to distinguish, like, what is ineptitude and what is actually, being maliciously done. And so I guess, Chris, my question for you is, like, you seem like a sort of heavy anti-establishment and anti-regime figure now. I mean, were you always that way? I feel like I kind of watched your thinking evolve as I watched your videos over the course of like 2020.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, great question. No, I was very much inserted in the matrix for a long time, right? So I went out and grabbed every brass ring I could, got a PhD, got an MBA, went and became a vice president of a corporation, even worked for Pfizer for about 3 years in corporate finance.
Bye. Get out.
Yeah.
Get out.
How dare you?
It
so
wasn't
you were
a good
really
fit.
plugged in. You were really plugged into the matrix.
I was. Yeah, absolutely. Full on.
And what happened?
Well, I would like to, the kindest I can be to myself is to say it was enlightened self-interest. But honestly, I was there. It was 2000. I was watching my portfolio get shredded, right? And I started to get curious and I started reading. And this was early internet. There wasn't a lot of stuff going on. It was harder to find things. So, but I kept asking these uncomfortable questions of my broker, like, why is this happening? They'd put me in WorldCom and stuff. And so I got curious and I stumbled across this book by G. Edward Griffin called The Creature from Jekyll Island. And it was like the blanket got ripped off because this guy just, with facts and data, which, I love, he just lays out exactly what happened. And I said, oh, it's a scam. I see this. Now, this is post MBA. You can teach somebody how the money system operates who's a fifth grader in about 10 minutes. It's not hard. I never run across it in all my schooling. In the NBA, they teach you how to compete for the little rubber ball in the arena, but they never tell you how the arena was made or why. Once I saw that, I'm like, oh, what a scam, right? And one thing led to another. And so I started to understand where this was all going. So that took me out of the matrix really hard because from there, I went into a little bit of an existential crisis. I ended up quitting my job I'm 42 at this time, 3 young children, and I start a blog. So never ask me for career advice. I just, but I'd had the golden handcuffs. I was walking away from a lot of stock options. I was working for a very big company at that time, not Pfizer. But once I saw what was happening, I said, oh, I started to synthesize these things. And I saw how the economy, actually, you can't look at it in isolation. You have to understand it with respect to the energy systems. You have to understand that with respect to the environment and what the waste streams are putting in, the resources we're taking out. And once you see that big picture, to me, it was clear that all of this is 100% unsustainable.
Yeah.
All of it. Yeah. And we all know that. And I think it makes a lot of people nervous. And so we have the displacement activities, when 2 cats are almost ready to fight and they decide they have to lick their private parts urgently right then. Right. I see a lot of this stuff we're talking about as people displacing a lot of anxiety, which they should have, right?
Yeah.
And I think that when we get to what Clifton's talking about, Mr. Duncan's talking about is this intentional, or is this just sort of ignorance, on display? The truth is that the people at the very top, they know the story as well. They know that they've forgot the economic system. They know that we've printed money that we can never pay back. They know we have liabilities that are unpayable. They know that the energy systems, we're at the peaking of this fossil experiment. We don't have any plan B, right? The whole ESG thing is kind of it's fun, but it's a scam, because if you understand basic physics, it just doesn't pencil out. So there isn't a plan. 8 billion people, no plan. And then, to get to Clifton's actual question, is it malice or ignorance? I go with malice, because I have this saying I picked up from the military, which is that once is an accident, twice is coincidence, but 3 times is enemy action. So we're being fed crickets like with this wall of propaganda. Mark Rutte out of the Netherlands is busy like trying to dismantle the second largest farming export community in the world. You just watch all of these assaults on farming. You're like, now? Why now? And you can't make sense of it through a rational lens. You have to look at it through another lens, which is, these people are intending to dismantle our food systems at this moment in time. And we're watching it happen in Canada. It's happening in the United States. It's happening in Europe. And the question is, why those countries? Why do I never hear about China dismantling its food systems?
Supply,
it's kind of weird.
I have a slightly different approach to it. I got red pilled, if you want to put it that way. Of course, the term didn't exist back in 1984, 85. Where I was living in Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship, and I was against it, but not for very profound reasons other than, I'd go to the marches against Pinochet because I'd pick up girls. That was my goal. I was 17, man. What the hell?
That's why I learned how to play guitar. It happens.
Yeah, exactly. And so, girls are a great motivator for anything, right? And so anyway, there was an article in Time magazine, of all places, about Chile. And I was in Chile at the time, of course, and they were talking about Chile. And I'm like, what the hell are they talking about? They're talking about nonsense. Now, there's something very interesting called the Gell-Mann fallacy, which was a term coined by Michael Crichton, the thriller writer, the doctor. And the Gell-Mann fallacy is basically that, you read the news, right? Whatsoever news magazine or newspaper you're reading, right? And you read one story, you read the next story, and you're like, oh, very interesting. And then you read a story about something that you actually know. And you're like, this reporter got it completely wrong. What's he talking about? But the fallacy comes in that you're like, this article about what I know is totally wrong. But then you go to the next article and just take it at face value. What happened to me, perhaps it was because of my young age or natural skepticism, whatever you want to call it, was that I started thinking, well, they're talking about Chile in this completely wrong-headed approach. What about other places that they're talking about? What about South Africa? Because at the time, South Africa was a big deal, apartheid and all that. And I was wondering, they're telling me that this is going on in South Africa. Is it accurate? Or are they feeding me a story? And then there would be other stories that they talk about. Nicaragua also was another big thing at the time. I started thinking, well, are they on the level, or are they feeding me bullshit like this article about Pinochet? And so that's how I started getting red pilled. And from that, I've just taken everything with a great deal of skepticism. And of course, sometimes it's proven on a personal level, very beneficial. On a public level, I've gotten into a hell of a lot of trouble for basically saying, hey, that sounds like bullshit. And everybody's like, no, how can you say that? You must be, whatever insult that comes handy at the time. I've been called Pinochet apologist. I've been called a racist. I've been called an anti-Semite. I've been called anti-Hispanic. Gonzalo Lira. I mean, that's kind of weird. But all these labels in the face of skepticism. And I think that's the thing that's happened to me. And to go back to your point, Clifton, and I want to hand it off to you, the issue as to whether they're smart or stupid, or malicious rather, or stupid, I think it's the metaphor or simile or whatever it is, analog, that I use is, see, the people in power inherited this power. They never earned it, and they have mismanaged it, and they have realized this. And so they don't really know how to manage it so as to improve it as previous generations did. And so they're squandering it and doing all kinds of spit and bale wire kind of fixes to keep it going, you see? And so that can be interpreted as malicious, because sometimes their efforts seem extremely malicious, but it's more an effort to keep it all going, because they don't know how to make it better. They can only fake it. And so that's my thinking about it. It's not that they're stupid or malicious, but rather they squandered what they inherited, and they're desperate to keep it afloat and keep it running before the whole thing goes kaput, goes bankrupt, collapses. You see, that's my approach. Clifton, do you agree, or you think you still think it's between stupidity and malice? Hello?
You're on mute, Clifton.
Sorry, I was typing and drinking. No, I lean more toward malice, just because I don't view these people as particularly stupid, which makes which makes a lot of this much more disconcerting. But then, as you both were speaking, I kept thinking about conformity and complicity in all these things, because there's only a few people who are in, quote unquote, at the top in these positions of power, but they work with a lot of people. There's a lot of people who are working under them. And I think one of the things that I've been so maybe perturbed is the word, is that people who are just sort of who are seeing these things unfold, and I think that there are a lot of people who see things the way that we do, but they keep silent for whatever reason. And one of those reasons, I've seen over and over again, is this idea of, well, I need to preserve my own career and my own reputation. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to ruffle any feathers. It just makes me wonder about the pervasiveness of people who just kind of say, well, I don't want to, I'm going to just kind of back off and not really, I see something going wrong, but I'm going to back off and not really engage with it. It's just, I guess the broader point is that I guess these people wouldn't be able to get away with any of this if there weren't so many people underneath them who didn't have the guts to step up and say anything and say, like, can you please stop doing this, or we'll push you out a window or something. You know what I mean? I don't, I don't know why people have been so reticent to or hesitant to
cowardly. Sorry, I have to interject.
Well, yeah,
I think it's
that's the word that I'm dancing around, and that's what has really been really bothersome to me. I have people who come to me privately and say, I agree with you, and but I gotta feed my I gotta feed my kids, and I have sympathy for that. But then it's like, well, what kind of world are you? What kind of example are you setting for your kids, and what kind of world are you leaving for them to live in? Once you're gone. I don't know.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lack of integrity. But also the thing is, see, the people in the leadership positions are so violent in their reactions. I mean, Chris, you've been on top of the COVID thing since this whole thing started. How did this happen that, by the way, you got on top of it so early on? What was the trigger for you?
Oh, that was easy. I'd heard some rumblings out of things. So I have a list of things that could possibly be triggers to take this overly complicated, overly complex system, which, by the way, as smart as anybody is, nobody's smart enough to figure out how to navigate this territory. It's just complex systems. They defy prediction. So I'm always looking for the triggers. And there was some early rumblings out of, it was January 2020 was probably the first week. There was some things that had come up about another respiratory virus, but China always has them, right? So then I wake up on the 22nd and I find out that Wuhan has been like closed off. There's police cars and they shut down the city. Now I know something about the Chinese, not a lot, but I do know they don't care about human life the way, we do, and supposedly we do. Right. So I'm like, wow, they would not shut down their major economic and commercial and chemical centers without like something really bad happening. So that woke me up and I immediately put out an alert. And I knew something was really wrong in this story because within 3 days, it had ticked off all the things for a pandemic that you would need to see from the WHO itself using their own guidelines, and they weren't declaring one. And then I knew it was really bad on February 5th. My wiki page, which had been up for 12 years, was taken down because I was declared by some anonymous editor to be a non-notable person who was speaking way out of his lane. And right, I'm like, okay.
Because you were taking off Wikipedia?
Yeah, they took me down.
Me too.
That page had been up 12 years, and I was non-notable because they said, his PhD is too long ago, and he hasn't written any papers lately.
Really?
So what could he know about pandemics? Blah, blah, blah,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, but that was because I was out of step then, because I was trying to warn people there was a pandemic. But if you remember those early days, what the WHO was doing, so bizarre. I love, we have to review these things because this context is important. At that point, I was saying, hey, this is a pandemic. It looks bad. We don't have a lot of information, but the early signs are, and the press in the US was trying to say, it's just the flu. The flu is worse, all of that. And the WHO was busy telling people that if we dared to stop flights from China, that would be racist.
Yeah.
Right. And I went to like the flight tracker, right, which you can see all the flights. And I noted something immediately in those last weeks of January, first weeks of February. China wasn't allowing any flights out of Wuhan to land anywhere internally to their country, but they were allowing them to go all over the world. I was like, come on, this is like, even George Washington knew how to stop, a smallpox pandemic. Like, you stop the emigration from the hotspot.
Exactly.
Duh. And they were busy saying they can't do that because it was racist. And then later they pretended they were the WTO and said, this could harm commerce too much. Like, it was all off. And so that was where I had my first signal that this was not about, it's a legit virus. Obviously it came out of a lab, 99.9% certainty about that.
No, the part of the DNA of the virus was actually patented by Moderna, I think.
Yeah, they had a DNA patent for a piece that became the RNA, which magically, not just part of the virus, but the part, which is the furin cleavage site, which makes it really bad and gave it all of its oomph, right? So, that's where I knew we were up against something else. And very quickly that led into a discovery of this thing called Event 201, which is, all the big players get together and have a fun little war game about how they would go about managing a coronavirus outbreak. Magically, we'd never had one like this, but they ran their simulation around that. And what was interesting when I looked into that, they spent zero time figuring out how they would save people. They spent all their time figuring out how would we, block misinformation and control the narrative and make sure that there wasn't any dissenting voices. Like, that was where they spent all their time, and it's staffed with the usual, the Gates Foundation funded it with the WEF is there. You've got CIA there. You've got Johns Hopkins. You've got all the major pharma companies. You've got big media. It's the usual cast of characters.
Yeah, what happened to me was that in mid-January, I started hearing about it on 4chan. 4chan is the image board of the dissidents. Yeah, that's when I started hearing about it. And 4chan now has become toothless because it's just been flooded by feds. But back then, there was still some life in 4chan, and I heard about it. And in fact, I made some trades based on that information because I was thinking, this is going to hurt supply chain. And so from China, so anything that's coming out of China, short it, And so I took out some really big positions on just about February 5th that you mentioned. And 6 weeks later, my counterparties were begging me to sell them back the positions. And it turned out to be like I literally sold at the top of the market. The only time I ever did that, but it's something that I always come up with because it's like the one time that I really nailed the market, right?
Nice.
But it was I was living at the time in Amsterdam because I was doing like a project there, and what happened was that I was stuck in Amsterdam. My family lives here in Kharkov, and what happened was that they're not here now, by the way. I'll get to that later. But what happened was that I was caught in Amsterdam when they turned off all the flights. And it was I think it was mid-April that I realized this is bullshit. And it was real simple because none of the homeless people were dropping dead. Because I lived in downtown, in the canal area in Amsterdam, okay? And great house there, right on the canal. And I would go to my office and there was nobody, right? And and I had broken my ankle skiing that February, so I was like hobbling along, on the down to my office, and I would pass the homeless people, and they were fine. None of them had died, and that's when I knew this is bullshit, because the homeless people would start to die first because they're drug addicts, they're in poor health, they're the ones who are going to get it and die, and then I realized this is bullshit, And then when the BLM thing happened, the virus can magically infect you if you go to your grandmother's funeral, but it cannot infect you if you go and squeeze together in Hollywood Boulevard in the
yelling
BLM.
and shouting.
Yeah. And I realized too that the whole thing was to dislodge Donald Trump from his epic economic surge that he was having at the time. I knew it's a controlled demolition of the economy just to get rid of Donald Trump, which I thought was crazy. I mean, why would you do such a horrible thing to so many countless millions of people? And everybody's like hunky-dory with it. It's a small price to pay. And you guys heard Sam Harris say that. Did you guys hear that?
Yeah.
Dude, I think he did a follow-up podcast as well.
Really?
Viva Fry. Yeah. Viva Fry did a short video on it.
Doubling down?
I listened to it yesterday. Yeah, he just was explaining his positions, and I'm thinking to myself, this is somebody who he rose to prominence in my eyes as somebody who spoke out against dogmatic thinking, and yet here's this person now who is just. I mean, it's just completely. It's derangement. He's completely deranged over his Trump hatred. It's unbelievable to watch.
Well, and we should talk about this because I do believe the Trump derangement syndrome is a thing. It was a weaponized program of psyops that was designed to install some belief systems in people, and it did, and it worked more aggressively against more intelligent people. Sam Harris to me is now a totem for something, and it's the power of this cult-like programming to mostly really infect, and I think irretrievably, the people who are more intelligent, because they get their ego wrapped up in it. Because now once if you consider yourself an intellectual, that's my identity. My identity. I'm a doctor. I'm a lawyer. I'm an intellectual, like Sam Harris likes to think. I'm a rationalist. And you fall for this. To get back out from under that, you have to go through a giant mea culpa, soul searching, and admit your fallibility and that you're actually just an ordinary human, not this hyper rationalist cortical wonder beast, right? He's just in too deep.
Good line.
I don't think he gets out of this without an ego shattering experience. So he'll defend that.
Shit. Sorry about that. It's the air raid siren. It's just the noise. Hang on, I'm going to move to a quieter place. Hang on. All right. I'm still here. It's just sorry about this.
I'll just move to a quieter place. So
pardon me, guys.
So Clifton, what was your red pilling? How did you know to avoid the juice?
Well, it was a fun process for me because I spent January through March of 2020 just completely terrified, and part of it, I was watching your video, so it helped me to prepare ahead of time. But over time, I think for me, I began to feel, maybe this is sort of my bleeding heart artist sensibility, but well, let me step back a little bit. For one, there was an article in the New York Times, I think it was like the April 2020, where they said that 3,700 deaths were going to be added to the death toll, pushing New York City's toll over 10,000. So I was in the city formerly known as New York at the time, which is like, the epicenter of all this stuff. So it's funny that Gonzalo mentioned homeless people, because I had the same sort of inclination of like, I'm texting my friends early on and saying like, what about what happens when this hits the homeless population? They're gonna, it's gonna be really bad, all this fear mongering. I mean, I'm telling you, Chris, I was literally, hello, hope he's safe. Gonzalo.
Oh, I'm right here. It's just annoying. Okay. Because the front line is about 10 to 15 kilometers away. Okay. I'm here in the Kharkov center. Right. And so, some shells fall, but they fall from where I am about, I'd say about minimum 3 miles, 2 miles, 3 miles. Okay. And that's as close as they get.
Listen to how calm he is about that.
I know.
Shells, they're like a couple miles away.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, see, the air raid sirens, they go throughout the city because each of these air raid sirens has only a range of maybe a quarter of a mile, half a mile tops. Okay, so them blaring it here, it serves no purpose, right? Because nobody's going to get hit here, and people here have already got. This has been going on for 6 months. Okay, so we know more or less what to expect, and so it's just annoying, yeah, so sorry about that. But maybe if we're lucky, there'll be like some big explosion out here, and I'll show you video before I run screaming for cover. But until that moment happens, this is annoying, man. Just leave me alone. Turn off your yapping.
Well,
but
we won't put that out into the universe. We don't want to manifest that. But I was just going through my whole sort of awakening process through the
I heard you.
Pandemic.
I heard everything you said. Yeah.
But I was at the point where I was wiping down my groceries and my mail and my phone and my keys, all kinds of stuff. I'm manically trying to sanitize every like knob and surface in our little shoebox apartment in Manhattan. I had a little paper towel with me that I would take to use on handles in public spaces. I mean, I was completely all in on this. And for one, it helps to have a diversity of opinion in your life, because I had one friend who was kind of, needling me a little bit, because I'm like pestering her, texting her with all these like statistics and, and numbers and, exponential growth and we're all going to die. And she was like, well, maybe read this article, maybe read this op-ed. And one of the op-eds she sent me was actually one of the ones early on by John Ioannidis, which I think Chris, you criticized actually.
Mm-hmm.
So it was good to, again, that's why it's great to just have a variety of perspectives. But I think maybe planting that seed of skepticism, because she was, thinking about, remember H1N1 during the Obama years, and it might not be as bad as they're making it out to seem, which annoyed me at the time. And but I said, well, I respect her opinion, so I'll keep that in the back of my mind, sure. And I was saying, as you said before, Gonzalo, I noticed that the homeless weren't really dropping dead, but I think the big thing for me was that it seemed to me like everything that we were being asked to do to mitigate the spread of the virus was just antithetical to any sort of enjoyment of life. And I said, it's one thing to exist, but it's another thing to actually live and to see so many people, especially New Yorkers. That's the funny thing. We were talking about, intelligent people, and New Yorkers, are some of the most pretentious people on the face of the planet. They think they're smarter than everybody else. And I think, ironically, that level of intellect, if you can even call it that, allows them, it actually strengthens their ability to justify complete bullshit or rationalize it. And it was funny because initially, everyone else was like, it's just the flu, bro. And I'm the one on the subway who's got masks on and my gloves on. And, because I'm following the science at this point, obviously. And everyone else was like, it's not a big deal. And then, of course, like a month later, then it was like, oh, everyone's going to die. I also observed, the World Health Organization is like, it's obvious this thing is spreading from person to person, but they're saying that it's not. They waited, we had YouTubers, so to speak, like Dr. Martenson, who were saying this looks like a pandemic, months before it was actually declared. There were just so many weird things going on. And what I was saying before was that there was this New York Times article where 3,700 deaths were added to the New York City, New York death toll, which pushed it over 10,000, which is big and scary and everything. But I said, but then, it said that they're presumed COVID deaths. And I'm thinking to myself, well, shouldn't we have as much accurate information as possible to try and determine how deadly this thing really is? Why are we just assuming these people have, that people died? They're not even being tested. I feel like we should probably know what's going on. Then you had the BLM protests, and it was like, okay, so wait a second, this virus has a sense of social justice, and it's going to not infect the people who are out protesting on behalf of George Floyd, but it is going to infect all the people who say, hey, don't lock our businesses down. And it just didn't make any sense. And when you had these 1,200 health professionals who signed on to say that racism is a public health threat. And I'm thinking to myself, well, then you're endorsing this activity, which is inevitably going to spread and cause more death among people of color. I don't see white supremacists being exactly upset about what's happening right now. So it doesn't make any sense what you're doing. And then 2 weeks later, nothing was happening. And no one really said anything. But on top of all of that, I had moved out of New York and I came to Atlanta, Georgia, where, things had been way, way, way less severe. And, it was just astonishing to me that, the nightclubs were packed, the bars were packed, there weren't mass deaths. You could get a lap dance at a titty bar, in Magic City in Atlanta, but you couldn't go see a Broadway show. There were just so many things that didn't add up over time. And it just didn't make any sense to me. And there was one point where Andrew Cuomo, gave this press conference where this reporter had the audacity to ask him a question about long-term economic ramifications of protracted lockdowns. How dare she ask that question? Why would she consider that such a thing? And he just laid into her about, death is worse than a bad economy, as if a bad economy couldn't also cause death. And, I said, I was filled with this sense of just panic, and I still can't describe the feeling to this day, but I said, that's when I knew I had to leave New York City, because I said, this man will do anything. He will justify any action he takes if his moral framework is so simplistic and so rigid and so stupid. And, I'm glad I got the hell out, because just to see what happened to see what's happened to the city since has been just really heartbreaking. But, to see, you have people informing on each other, you know what I mean? They're encouraging this kind of snitch culture. And it was just really disturbing to me to see what people were being reduced to. But I think but again, the broader point for me was saying initially, like, everything we're being asked to do is just completely antithetical to life. But then I got, then to address the question of why, your question, Chris, of why I just said, I don't want this medical product, we'll call it that, to be polite.
Mm-hmm.
I caught COVID in late 2020, in December of 2020. Which is before these products are being widely distributed. And already at that point, as I'm sure all this data about natural, or infection-conferred immunity and T cells, memory cells was already coming out. And frankly, at that time, I was also thinking, well, we've never been able to successfully vaccinate against a coronavirus. I'd already been listening to what Geert Vanden Bossche was saying, and I have my own history of like high blood pressure, and and there's a whole different side of my family that whose medical history that I don't know. There was already that signal about myocarditis, pericarditis that was popping up in men in my age group. So there were a bunch of reasons, not to mention that, Moderna as a company has never brought anything successful to market, or, the history of Pfizer. Also, I thought that, on the left, so to speak, or the liberals, already understood that these are big, greedy corporations who don't really have your best interests in mind. I mean, Chris Rock once famously said that the money's not in the cure, the money's in the medicine. And we're just supposed to fall at the feet of Pfizer and do whatever they say. There was just so many things that I just said, this is just really off to me. And the harder they pushed, the stranger it got for me. They were really, really, really pushing these shots really hard, which made me back off even more. And, then they started introducing these passports, and which to me, it was funny to watch the liberals in New York, the city formerly known as New York, go full on in the arts community, go full on into anti-racism, because by definition, these vaccine passports are a racist policy. And so they would pay these anti-racist leftists would pay lip service to anti-racist ideals. But then they would impose, to see Nicole Hannah-Jones, for instance, the Pulitzer winner for the 1619 Project and champion of Black people and Black protest or whatever. She's jetting around the world, and she's, tweeting out her support for these vaccine mandates. You do realize that they're disproportionately discriminating against people who look like us. So there's just this complete abandonment of people's principles and values, and so many masks came down. And so just all of that, I said, I don't want to participate. I don't want to participate in any of this. I'm not taking this stuff. There's too many things that's wrong with it, and I just don't trust it. And the fact that you can't even ask questions about it makes me even more resistant and hesitant. So that's my 20-minute rant. And
no, it's perfectly fine.
It's great. If I could react to part of that. So speaking of the Manhattan liberal class, I had a bit of difficulty with a gentleman there who he's married to a black woman. He's Caucasian and Jewish and very, very, very much into issues of races, racial issues, all of that. Except when I was starting to talk about this whole thing, he very much wanted me to stop talking about all the COVID stuff. And so I challenged him at one point and I said, listen, probably the single thing we could do that would help the black community and also any other dark skin community is vitamin D. Here's the data. The data is overwhelming. It's simple. It's cheap. And this is the case of the dog that did not bark. Nobody's talking about vitamin D. The NIH still to this day doesn't have enough data to recommend for or against, right? And I just like, hey, if you really care about this, we can align on this. Why don't we, join forces around vitamin D? Let's make a campaign. Let's get all your liberal friends to donate. Let's distribute this stuff. Let's find the black communities and the leaders and the pastors who can, help spread the word, because this would be one of the single greatest healthcare advances, not just for COVID, but for other things too, probably. And this would be fabulous. What's the harm? What's the foul? Couldn't do it. Wouldn't do it. Right. And that's when I realized that none of this was actually about the true morals and the true, the lip service is just lip service. When you get down to actually making the actions align with the ideas and the words, if they don't line up, you're out of integrity. And so that's what I was detecting in this story over and over again, was just profound gaps in integrity.
And I'd say, even on top of that, just that with, and I don't mean to narrow it down into the race aspect, but it's a part of the broader conversation about a complete lack of principles. So Atlanta, Georgia is what they call a chocolate city. It is a 56% black population. I had to go to one of the urgent care clinics around here because I actually caught a really bad case of bronchitis after my COVID infection. So so I'm in their email system. So they send me this email in April of 2021. And in this email, it says, this pandemic has shown us the importance of vitamin D. Now, if this local urgent care clinic in Atlanta, Georgia is sending out the signal about vitamin D, where are the higher ups in public health? Where are these public health authorities? Why aren't they saying this? And then on top of that, there is an argument for higher, let's say, medical product, quote unquote, uptake in Black America, given the rates of obesity, hypertension, heart disease, these kinds of things, which are comorbidities for the virus. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that Black people they ain't taking it. For whatever reason, they're not taking it. And if you truly cared about the health and well-being of Black Americans, then you would be talking about vitamin D, as you pointed out, Chris, and you would be talking about weight loss. You would be talking about lifestyle improvements. But the thing is, what we got instead was them dragging out these old ass, tired, washed up rappers doing insulting rap videos, talking about vax that ass up, instead of treating Black people. I'm dead serious. This actually happened.
I remember.
Instead of treating Black people like grown-ups and saying, like, here's some other ways you can help. I mean, it could have been a big sort of, I hate to use this term, but cultural revolution in terms of the health and well-being. But just like other health and wealth disparities throughout this entire process, I mean, those now, are just going to be widening gaps. But it goes back to what you were saying or talking about, Chris, is that, these people completely, it's not about public health, at a certain point. It's just about sticking to some sort of rigid ideology. And if you actually cared about Black people, you wouldn't be doing stupid shit like importing, like imposing vaccine passports. You would be talking about things like vitamin D. You'd be talking about weight loss and the importance of exercise. But they're not doing that. And so that's a big signal for me that these people actually not only don't care about public health, but then they don't care this so-called anti-racist, quote unquote, progressive class. They don't care about Black people and Black health. I mean, it's so obvious to me now.
No, they care about Black votes. That's what they care about.
Right.
And so, yeah, my evolution on the whole issue of the magic medicine is During 2020, there was something else that was happening to me. It wasn't just the homeless people who weren't dying. It's that nobody in my extended circle of acquaintances had gotten a couple had gotten sick, but they'd said, oh, it was no big deal, and nobody had died. And so I was like, well, this is supposed to be a big pandemic. And between people I know directly and the people they know, a few hundred people, right? And none of them had died, and multiple continents. So what's going on here? And then in December, right after the election, Pfizer announces that they have the magic medicine. I'm thinking they delayed this until after the election. So it's number one, political. Number two, as I understand it, every single drug goes through decades of testing before it's used on a widespread basis, because they want to avoid the thalidomide thing. Because I read about the thalidomide thing years ago, but I read it at the time in great detail. It was horrifying. For those of you who don't know, look up thalidomide. It was a drug that's actually used for leprosy very effectively. And it was also used as a tranquilizer for a time in the 50s. And it was prescribed to pregnant women. And pregnant women who took it, their children were born with severe deformities. I mean, really tragic. Those who survived, because many of these children died at birth. And so I thought to myself, this is crazy to be putting out this magic medicine. And I also remember reading years ago, and later, of course, I've jogged my memory and read a lot more of it, that you never vaccinate in the teeth of a pandemic, because then it's kind of pointless, and it actually improves the viability of the virus because it mutates to adapt to this new medicine. And so I thought, this is crazy. And then when I heard that it was based on the mRNA technology that had never survived the animal trials because all the animals died, I'm like, what are they doing? And that's the thing that I want to pivot the conversation a little bit towards this very dangerous topic. And so I'd ask you both, and chat, indulge us, but ask you both to be very careful how you mention this. There seems to be a lot of excess. We won't say the noun, just use the adjective as the noun. A lot of excess as of late. And it seems to be increasing month over month. And people are really noticing it. It started being noticeable at the beginning of this year. And the people who are noticing it, interestingly enough, are the insurance people and the mortuaries. They're noticing an increase, and they're sounding the alarm, and it's slowly starting to percolate. And I've noticed that a few places here and there are starting to talk about Trump's magic medicine. And that is always a giveaway. I mean, it seems at this time that a big wave, it's like the swell of a wave, you see the swell and it's just moving and growing, it seems like that we're going to get a wave of excess. And Chris, I'll throw it to you because you're probably on top of this data.
Oh, unfortunately I am. It's tragic. It's really sad. It's hyper disturbing. To get back to the earlier part, when they first ran the trials to check this magic stuff out, they specifically excluded a lot of people. They specifically excluded people with diabetes. They specifically excluded pregnant women or women who might get pregnant. They were excluded. So they weren't even part of the data. And then you get this emergency authorization. It comes out, and that very next week, because I save these things, I keep receipts, you had OBGYN doctors saying, oh, this is totally safe, right? They had no basis to say that. They had no data. There's still no data. Still, if you look at the safety sheet for this magic stuff, it still says in Section 8, we don't have enough data on this. And by the way, we now have data that has come out of the real world. There are a lot of excess problems in that arena, and it's tragic and it's awful. And I actually know people who miscarried in the third trimester. I know them, right? Who went down this program. So it's really tragic. It's really awful. And we just had a leak that came out of the Ministry of Health in Israel yesterday, 2 days ago. Somebody had recorded a conversation. So Israel went way over the tips of the skis. They went all in on this whole thing, right? And the most of any country out there. And it turned out that they hadn't even been collecting safety data for the first 12 months. Didn't collect it. Then they were forced to, and they did collect it for 6 months. And the leaked recording shows that it came back so bad that the questions they were asking to themselves were, this seems to be sort of a medical legal quandary. How are we going to handle this from a legal standpoint? So the choice they made was to continue to sit on it and hide it for another 3 months.
Typical.
Right? So
typical.
So very typical, but we have to begin to ask the question, like, how is this possible? Because I have to confess, one of the projections I have about Israel is that it protects its own people, right?
Yeah.
It, like, out of countries that exist out there, there's a few that I think do a fabulous job of saying, we're going to protect our own, right? I put Israel near the top of that list, and it's fabulous, but in this case, they didn't. And so I don't understand the level of corruption of integrity, of thought. Is it money? I don't have a framework for understanding it, but I can tell you these things we're talking about. We now have another 2 pieces of data that have come out. This is off of Steve Kirsch's Substack, that there's both within the first 14 days after administration, there's a big problem. That there's a huge signal, and that shows up in the VAERS data. But there's another peak that shows up 5 months later. And so if you look at, there's a 5-month offset. That never shows up in VAERS, because VAERS is all about temporal association. Doesn't happen. So when you look at it, this is because the Social Security Administration, somebody leaked to him a database they have showing 50 to 60% excess 5 months after the peak of the administration. And so it's not even what we're talking about here. If these numbers are right, is like 3 to 7 Vietnam in terms of losses, right? I mean, this is extraordinary.
Vietnam, how many people died in Vietnam? 60,000? Yeah.
60, 70,000, I think, something like that. Like, we're talking hundreds of thousands. So this is really extraordinary what we're talking about here. And it's completely obvious. And of course, now people have started to see some of the signs of this, like, hey, how come this Scottish fit ultra, mountain bike champion,
that bicyclist,
Brad Wardell, right? What happened there? Or wait, what are with all these young men dropping on hockey rinks and soccer pitches and things like that? And it's become really very unavoidable at this point. So when we get back to the Palpatine speech, I honestly felt some desperation in that. And I feel like that was to try and redirect us into some new, emotional, territory, because this thing we're talking about now, it can't be hidden a lot longer. It's gotten bad. It's gotten so bad that, remember when they came out and they gushed and they're like, oh, and the New York Times, they're all like, oh, we're so excited we can finally do these things to kids, infants. The uptake on that single percentage, like 90+% of parents are like, hell no, No. And so even with all the propaganda and all the attempt to create this sense that everybody's doing this and you're not part of the in crowd if you're not, the answer is people have caught on. And we see that in the dropping uptake of all these things, right? And all of this culminates where 2 days ago, the FDA gets together in the ACIP meeting and approves this bivalent stuff, right? with 0 human testing, 8 mice.
Fill me in on that, because I haven't been following it.
Oh, they want to have an update booster, right? But they changed the formulation and they call it bivalent, meaning it both protects for the original strain, which is the original stuff, plus Omicron, but not the BA.5 that's everywhere, something called BA.1. So they put this bivalent thing, but we already know the first part of this doesn't work. It's like, so they said half of this we already know doesn't work. The other half is for a version that's actually not present in the population really anymore. So it probably doesn't work there either. And then they didn't test that. This is the first time in human history that they're going to go forward with a product like this with 0 human testing. 8 mice. That's all they have.
I heard that. 8 mice. Yeah.
Yeah. So
the 3 blind mice thing is unavoidable. I mean, what the hell? I mean, how is it?
They weren't blind before the trials.
I mean, you can't make this up, right?
Right. I know.
It's It's as obscene as the Palpatine speech. Like, these things are just assaulting us. You're like, you can't. Somebody thought this through. They chose that backdrop, right? What? Right? But it's the world we live in. So it's just a clown show, or is it, again, Clifton, malice or incompetence? Where are we?
Well, it's just I try to break it down, and this is one of the few places that maybe some actor training has some merit. But you try to break things down into the whys, the motivations. Who are these people? What do they want? Why do they want what they want? What are they going to do to overcome the obstacles that are in their way? And when you approach a scene, you ask yourself, what do I expect going in? What are my expectations at the top? How do they change? And I look at how these people are behaving, and it's like, yeah, I guess if I were in this position where, all of my research funding came, was at the behest of Anthony Fauci. If I worked at a media organization which got a lot of money from the Gates Foundation, I would probably, I'm probably in a nice place, a nice position. I got a nice family, I got a nice house, I got kind of, a decent kind of life. I want to save that. I want to preserve that. So I'm going to look the other way when I see these things that are happening. And I'm not going to say anything. I think also there's the social pressure as well. I mean, people they don't want to be perceived, as being on the out group. They don't want to be seen as bad people. I mean, one of the questions I've been pondering a lot, with regard specifically to the New York arts community, is there seems to be this weird bifurcated reality where on one hand, I keep hearing from people whose, their parents or they themselves. I mean, I just spoke to some performers or ex-Broadway performers yesterday. A guy took the medical product and now he's having issues with his heart, which he didn't have before. Another friend of mine, two friends of mine, their mothers are dealing with adverse reactions right now, which they don't attribute to these particular medical products. So there's this huge blockage now. People, even though I am encouraged, Chris, by the data you're talking about in terms of uptake for younger people, I also am just really stymied and baffled when I see people completely unable to even entertain the idea in their mind that there might be something wrong. So there seems to be this weird dual reality where on one hand they're completely safe and effective, and they're the only way. They're a one ticket out of this mess. And on the other hand, people are suffering lots of people are suffering really bad consequences, including like miscarriages and so on and so forth. And it seems to be a widespread problem. I'm like, how can these two things be coexisting at the same time? It just makes it even more confusing for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah. One of the things that really popped up to me was in when was it, 2021? Two women that I know, one 29 and the other 36. They both got cancer, uterine cancer. And it was just really weird. One is in Chile and the other is in Holland. One of them died, the one in Chile. And the medical care was the best that could be provided. And it was just, she died. And the other is on chemo, but, it's just like a nightmare. And I found it profoundly weird. And when I spoke to them, they were all in on the vaccine. And of course, I didn't have the heart to tell them, what would be the point of saying, oh, it was probably the vaccine that did it. I realized it as I was talking to them. But it was pointless for me to point that out. I mean, what purpose would it serve? But in my own case, like I said, in December, when this rolled out, I was very negative on the whole thing. I thought that this is crazy to be taking this medication. And as I learned more, and there's also, it seems, as I understand it, Chris, you might know better than me about this again, it seems that this medicine is inherited, some characteristics of it in terms of the diminishing strength of people's immune response. It seems to be passing on to the children of people who have taken the magic medicine, and that they are suffering childhood diseases that normal children aren't affected by, or is just trivial, and it's affecting them. I mean, this is like a complete shit show. And my thinking is, like you said, Clifton, it's that nobody wanted to be out of step. If everybody else is doing it, well, I'm not going to raise my hand. I'll just go along. And I think that is the most pernicious thing. I thought that in the West, we were supposed to teach people to think independently and critically. And it turns out that we've really just educated people into becoming lemmings, and they're all going off the cliff altogether. It's almost as if, and there's also a weird thing too, that I've talked to some people who have gotten the magic medicine and they're like, well, everybody else took it, so, I'll be fine. It's a weird fatalism, almost like they're aware of it, but since their misery is they're gonna have company in their misery, well, then it's okay. And I'm like, I don't get it. I don't get it at all. And for the life of me, I do not understand how people got suckered, and it's so obvious. I'm sorry. I'm ranting. I don't have anything intelligent to say. I mean, it's stupefying.
Well, that's
Chris,
where we have
bail
to,
me out.
we got to get over. That's why I wander over and talk to people like Matthias Desmet about mass formation and all of that. You have to talk to psychiatrists, psychologists. You got to talk to people about psyops, all of this. I put a program out recently just talking about this level of control and social control that was put out there. And it's astonishing to me. Like, I love little anecdotes. So by April of 2020, the Canadian military was already taking its propaganda arm and turning it against its own people to see what they could do to get people up on the program of government control over the populace in order for the populace to do what the government wanted. Now, they didn't use that propaganda to do good things, Clifton, like telling people to maybe lose weight, get some more exercise, go out, get some sun, get some vitamin D. Nope. They used it to weaponize people to be afraid, to lock down, and then later to take these magic interventions. And they didn't ask permission. They didn't have permission. They didn't feel like they needed to ask permission to run military propaganda against their own population. It's all written up. It's in the newspapers. It's just like a thing they noted, like, oh, here's some things they did, right? And good critical thinking people ought to be going, hold up here. We don't understand yet the complexity of what happens when you propagandize an entire population, because a culture, a group of people, is actually a complex organism, meaning you can't predict what's going to happen. You can only test and then observe. So they're running these experiments, which actually have legit profound impacts, including we see now increased suicide rates, increased rates of demoralization. It's showing up now in work, quiet quitting, and people are checking out. Like, there were huge impacts to this, not least of which was the things they were telling people to do now turn out to have been the wrong things to do. So great. Who made this decision to go ahead and do this? Well, in the case I'm talking about is a General Mike Rouleau. What's his training to go out and conduct social experiments that have unknown, wide-ranging impacts, some of which could be fatal? Zero. He's a military guy, He probably knows how to lob artillery and other stuff, but it's just crazy that we're at this stage where we're running vast human experiments on ourselves, and we're not allowed to question that without being declared an insurrectionist, right? It's just bizarre.
One of the things I've noticed is that starting with BLM, that's when I noticed it. See, in outside the United States, people don't know this. Most people don't know this, but the United States has been very good at overthrowing foreign governments by way of what's known as color revolutions. And color revolutions are very, very simple. What they do is the American government, through intermediaries, funds NGOs, non-governmental organizations, in the targeted country. And these NGOs have names like, Democracy Now!, always something like democracy and freedom and variations thereof. Yes. Interestingly enough, most of them use the logo of a clenched fist. And when you see that logo, a variation of a clenched fist with a circle around it, you know what you're talking about. It's weird. Mm-hmm. It's like they reuse they recycle the same logo. And they've done it in multiple places. There's actually a meme floating around that shows the different logos of the different countries, and they're all identical, like made by the same guy. But anyway, the point is the color revolution is that the NGO will recruit local people and teach them how to be agents provocateurs, how to destabilize a country. And when a legitimate crisis happens in that country, whatever the crisis, maybe people are upset because they cut the pensions to the elderly people, or the price of gas goes up too much, whatever the cause, and people are legitimately upset about it, the NGOs will go out and just start lighting fires, just feeding into this. And they, of course, carry out acts of violence against the police. And this is what happened in Ukraine in 2013, 2014. These NGOs went and radicalized people who had legitimate grievances with the government at the time, but they just ramped up the violence, just turned up the knob all the way to 11. And what happened was that this destabilizes a country. This has been done multiple times. And the examples aren't important at this point. The issue becomes that approach to destabilizing the legitimate authority of a country. That was basically applied in the United States with the BLM riots. Because if you notice, a lot of people started noticing that in any city where there was going to be a BLM riot, all of a sudden these pallets with bricks would appear out of nowhere, just magicked out of nowhere, And everyone's like, where are these pallets coming from? And you notice too that in a lot of these BLM protests, there'd always be one guy saying, "Let's go beat up the cops. Let's go. And got to the point where people started saying, "Hey, that guy's a Fed," and they started pointing. You saw that guy Epps at the January 6th insurrection, which was, if they're going between the velvet ropes, how much of an insurrection really is it? You know what I'm saying? Anyway,
yeah.
It seems to me that they applied a color revolution in the United States during 2020, and they don't know how to roll it back, and it's just been increasing. You know what I mean? And of course, magically after Biden won the election, all the BLM riots, they just got shut down. How did that happen? Right? They got the result they wanted, and so they just shut it off, like you shut off the faucet, And so the thing becomes that they are manipulating everybody and short-circuiting the democratic process. They are short-circuiting the will of the people, and they are leaving destruction in their wake, and ruined lives, ruined businesses. The whole ship of the country is sinking, at least in the United States, and there is no recourse, because what's happening also is that when people have legitimate grievances, like the Canadian truckers, like the Dutch farmers, the German farmers, the Spanish farmers, they get shut out. They get shut down in Canada. They strip people of their bank accounts, their jobs. I mean, they even took away their trucks. In the Netherlands, the protests are going on nonstop, and the media is just absolutely silent about it. It's like it's not even happening, even though the people there are saying, "Hey, look what's happening," and they're just no. It's that approach. It's really the attitude of a colonial power controlling and manipulating the masses and the people, and just keeping them down while they milk the country. That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
It's so funny. I have a lady friend who actually works in agriculture. Her father especially, and she had no idea what was going on with the Dutch farmers at all.
Really?
In the States? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I had to send her links about it. It's just, it kind of goes back into this idea of that this huge sort of marketing and propaganda campaign of and to see people's complete points of view and opinions change with the news cycle it would be thrilling and enjoyable to watch if it weren't steering us into a ditch.
Yeah, quite the ditch. And I was talking with a friend of mine from Guatemala and sort of explaining this whole thing, and he just basically said, "Hey, you're just doing to yourselves what you've been doing to the rest of the world for a long time. So the machinery has been turned against your own populace." And so wasn't very encouraging, because he said, "Oh, next are the mass arrests and then the disappearances," right?
Yeah, that and the Dark Brandon speech, the Emperor Palpatine speech, they're saying it, they're announcing it. They're going to start arresting people and just sending them to Gitmo or wherever they have their little gulag, and with no possibility of getting a lawyer or getting bailed out. No, you're going to be disappeared. I mean, that seems to be the direction of travel in the United States.
Well, I'm going to say that.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure that it's going to be a physical camp. I'm more certain that they figured out a much more cost efficient capitalist sort of way to do this. We'll get these things called central bank digital currencies,
right?
And then, Oh, I'm so sorry, Clifton. You're such a troublemaker. Your currency no longer works more than 5 kilometers from your house. We put this geo fence around, and your credit card or chip in your hand will not actually work anywhere else. And by the way, you can't actually buy a ticket for anything, so you can't travel. Like, they'll just put these fences around people and they'll punish you. And they'll just basically, because we've already seen this, right? They've already said to doctors who dared speak out against this medical orthodoxy that was wrong, we're going to strip your licenses away. We're seeing right now in California, there's a law that's on Newsom's desk that he can sign, which basically says if a doctor is caught spreading medical misinformation about COVID, they will lose their license, right? Yeah. So back to your point, Clifton, like when you take somebody's livelihood, and listen, somebody who's trained all their life, or, you know, they've got $300,000 student loans, and they wanted to be a doctor, and they've got 2 kids, you know, and a house and a car, all, you know, bought on debt. You own them, right? It's very hard to buck the system. If the system says, oh, by the way, if you disappoint us, we're going to disappear you economically, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's where we're headed with this.
Especially because of the hyperinflation that's coming. I'm sorry, Clifton, right. I interrupt you.
No. I mean, it's just, you know, it's just take a common sense approach to it. You know, if you can't hold it, is it really yours? That's my whole point about currency.
You will own nothing and be happy.
Well, you know, that's what they say, you know. But you know, it's just, but who are they to decide that for? I mean, that's been one of the major things for me this whole time, is who are you people to decide for the rest of us what would be best for us? It's so ridiculous to watch, but it's also funny too, because to see people. I think once you get outside of, like, maybe, you know, the blue bubble, like I would talk to people. I was working at a nightclub very briefly, and you know, I would talk to guys at the door, and they would come in and talk about, yeah, they're trying to move us to a cashless society, man. You gotta hold on to what you got, brother. I'm like, you know, so I mean, it is funny that people are, but you know, then I talk to black folks who are like, you know, DMX took that shot, right? And, you know, and the rapper, he passed away, you know, in his early 50s last year. But, you know, just random rantings. But in talking to people, I completely derailed the conversation. But the whole idea, you know, for me, one of the things that I protested against early on was this idea of precedent. And I actually spoke to Naomi Wolf about this recently, because she's sort of been on point about this, because I began to try to make parallels with the war on terror to some of my more left-leaning friends early on. I said, you know, remember what the Republicans were doing in the wake of 9/11, and everything was about our safety and about our security. And now, you know, I still run into people at airports today who are of a certain age and say, man, I remember travel before 9/11. You know, it was a whole different animal back then. And, you know, they signed the Patriot Act into existence, and you know, Bush has his, like, FISA wiretapping scandals and surveillance scandals and all this other stuff. And then Obama gets into office and signs the National Defense Authorization Act. And it turns out that, you know, he's sitting on this massive surveillance apparatus. So, you know, it's not really even a partisan thing. It's just that the government will keep encroaching on certain freedoms and liberties in the name of our safety and security. And it's hard to make these things go away. We can learn how to treat a virus. We will evolve to resist a virus, but these government policies at the same, you know, on the other hand, can have longer, are going to be harder to get rid of and overturn once they're there. And, you know, I said at one point, the precedent has been set. So even if everything was to snap back to normal tomorrow, who's to say that there won't be some other emergency that's concocted, shall we say? And that's when they're going to say, oh, you know, do the things you're talking about, Chris. Oh, you know, you can't shop now because we're going to shut off your currency. Oh, you said this online. I call the Silicon Valley, I call them the reality cartel. You know, you can't, you said this opinion online, and that's troublesome to the government. You're an enemy of the people. So now you can't do anything. And people, it might sound extreme to people, but you know, you just don't trust your government. Don't trust these people, these corporations that are in power and controlling all these things. And even if it doesn't happen now, they're laying the groundwork. So in the future, it could happen. And, you know, there are structures being put in place that could be extremely problematic. And, you know, it's just people are the level of trust that people have, the blind sort of obedience that people have been expressing has been just really astonishing to me.
Yeah.
And, you know, I used to think that the Internet of Things was going to be the troublesome part. that, you know, if you said the wrong thing, your refrigerator would shut down and not allow you to open it for X number of days. But yeah, the digital currency seems to be a much more elegant solution to the problem, much more cost effective and easier to implement. And the dollar is going to hyperinflate. I mean, that seems to be pretty clear. We're at the early stages of it, but we're already seeing it. The euro is going to tank first. And I'm guessing that in Europe, they're the ones who are going to implement the digital currency first, sort of like a trial balloon to see how effective it is. Because, you know, in Europe, like I mentioned before, I was living in the Netherlands, and, you know, everything is on your cell phone. I mean, absolutely everything, right? You know, any kind of bureaucratic process, your banking, travel, everything is on your little phone. And that seems to me a society where it would be very easy to implement a digital currency of some sort, especially if the euro craters, like it's looking like it's going to crater. And from there, you know, in the United States, they'll be able to take a lot of lessons from that, implement the same thing in the United States once the dollar goes tits up. And, you know, then everybody's going to be basically a slave to the government. And what I find most troubling of all, I do not see a class of people who can rise up, oppose this, and take the reins of power to you know, take the country or the civilization, Western civilization, take it in a better direction. Because it seems to me that this establishment that we currently have has co-opted everyone. There is no opposition. The only people who are opposed to this are marginal figures. I mean, I count myself as a very, very marginal figure in this whole dance. And no disrespect to either one of you, I would think that you're in the same boat as I am in terms of we're not near any kind of levers of power. We don't have the ability to really change things. And the only people who might be able to, they seem very few, very far between, and suspect. I mean, I'm thinking of Tulsi Gabbard and Ron DeSantis, who seem to be opposed to this stuff, but they come from the same miasma. And I'm wondering, you know, will they really, or are they just playing a role? And they'll be the acceptable opposition, but it'll be, you know, a different suit, but same old shit. You know what I mean? That's my concern, because I don't see a leadership class, a dissident leadership class, that if there were to be a revolution of some sort, would be able to take the reins of power and steer everything in a better direction. Or do you guys see something like that? Some class of people like that?
Well, they exist. And so the model I have is we call ourselves the remnant, right? It's sort of a biblical term from the prophet Isaiah. It's around that in moments of great turnings, there's always a small subset of people who can see it, aka Cassandras, aka marginal dissidents, right? There always is a small group of people. And we have a very important role to play, which is that you can see it's going to go to shit and break. And you have to hold your humanity, and you have to make sure that you're sort of the keepers of the flame, so that when it's time to rebuild, all these other people, their whole lives are destroyed. They never saw it coming, right? And when the rebuilding happens, you need people who can still like operate and put one foot in front of the other and keep moving. So I think nature in its infinite wisdom has given us all sorts of different actual diversity, not the stuff that they're talking about these days, but real diversity. And so there are people who are already quiet quitting in a sense. Like, look, I know in my heart of hearts, these people, these forces we're talking about, they are control freaks. They're going to try and control this all. Like, if we could just dial every lever and use our AI to make sure that Gonzalo only buys what we tell him to buy, when we buy, where he wants. It's like trying to squeeze a fistful of jelly. It's going to come out awkwardly. It's going to break, right? You know, and that's just how my model for this is. They're trying to control the uncontrollable. And the larger sweep of this that people need to be aware of is where we are as a species, not US, not Europe, not China, is a species on a finite planet. We're running out of the good stuff. The wildebeest herd is getting a little nervous, because normally when you run out of grass in the valley, you go to the next valley. There's no valley to go to anymore, right? We've punched holes in every corner of this earth, and unless the Arctic melts and shows us some tasty, gooey goodness up there, we know what we got. And this is and there is no plan. So the plan, such as it is can we control this? We have to lie to people. We can't say we're in this mess because we, the leaders, screwed up and we didn't. But trust us, we're the right people to lead you forward. They can't say that. So they're going to have to try and give us these existential threats like a coronavirus, like who knows what comes next. But you've seen the trial balloons, oh, we need climate lockdowns. Let's try, let's try energy lockdowns. Like, it's coming because they can't just be honest and say, look, we're going to have to really try some different things here. The whole standard of living that we accumulated is in peril. We're going to have to tighten our belts a little bit. Hey, sorry, we can't have, soccer moms driving kids in F-250s, getting, 12 miles a gallon. It's just, we have to do things differently. And they don't have the balls to give us the proper vision to say, here's where we're going. Right. So what do we get instead? Control freak stuff, right? We're going to AI through your phone. That's great, but that story is one coronal mass ejection, one grid down event from being completely useless, right? And we live in a world now where if that breaks down, if we have a kinetic war, a cyber war, a something where China says that's it, we're not shipping component parts, or they attack Taiwan and we don't get chips, the whole thing breaks. Literally, the whole thing. There's not a country I can study right now, except for some smaller third world countries that are legitimately self-sufficient and could actually sustain themselves in a reasonable capacity if trade
Except
stopped.
Russia. Russia's the only one that can.
Russia can.
Yeah.
To a point.
Actually, it's kind of shocking. They've made more money over the last 6 months than they made all of last year.
The ruble is rubble.
Oh yeah, that worked like a charm, didn't it? No, I mean it's unbelievable. I know a lot of people who are in Russia, and they're saying, things are hunky dory here. I mean there isn't any, and you don't have to take my word for it. There are lots of YouTubers who are in Russia who are posting, life in Russia. Supermarkets are full, which cannot be said about Dutch supermarkets. One of the bread baskets of the world, they don't have enough food for the supermarkets. Okay. And so, the Russians are sitting pretty, and it's remarkable how the policies that the West implemented against Russia, and it's really just economic warfare. They call it hybrid warfare, but all wars are not just armies fighting each other, but also cutting trade and trying to disrupt the other's economy. When Napoleon invaded Russia back in the early 19th century, he deliberately printed a whole bunch of fake rubles to destroy the Russian economy. This kind of economic warfare is part and parcel of any normal war. Okay, so they're calling the sanctions like a hybrid war. No, it's just war by another name. And the West declared war on the Russians, and the Russians know this. And today they said all of a sudden, oh, something, the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline, it's not working anymore because there was some oil leaks that were shutting. Yeah, who could have known? I mean, come on, man. They're just, it's tit for tat as so far as the Russians are concerned. And today I read that the Brits were estimating that 1 in 7 elderly people in Britain will not have heat this winter. 1 in 7. Okay, you're gonna have older people freezing to death. And everybody's like la di da. And they don't have the humility to say we fucked up. We're going to go back to the Russians and try to fix this. They don't have the humility. And they say that pride goeth before the fall. And I think that we're seeing that it's the reason I'm so flabbergasted by this whole situation is because I grew up in Southern California in the 70s. And Southern California in the 70s, in the early 70s, I remember it. You could feel it in the air. There was this feeling that everything was wonderful. It truly was the Golden State. And that everything was going to be beautiful and you could accomplish anything you wanted. You wanted to go to the moon? You make it happen. You can do it. But now it's this cowardice, as you said, Clifton. It's this lack of ambition and lack of vision. It's an inability to listen to an opposing point of view. And not just, an inability to listen to an opposing view, an inability to listen to that opposing view and realize, hey, he's got a good point. I'm going to integrate that good point into my worldview so that I have a better grasp of the world and can achieve my ambitions. There's no sense of that anymore. And it's just a tragedy. I look at it, it just breaks my heart, you know? Sorry for this little mini rant, but it truly breaks my heart to see how far the United States in particular has fallen. I just don't get it. How did they fuck it up so badly? But anyway, yeah, I'm a little bit lost because I ranted too much. You guys, one of you guys is going to have to bail me out right now because I'm drowning in my sorrows.
Well, the good news is that the legacy media is just dying on the vine.
Oh yeah,
and people who are daring to, I don't consider myself a truth teller, but man, I can smell bullshit really far off in the distance, right? So that's my superpower. But I watch, like, you know, Joe Rogan just crushing the landscape, right? Because he dares to have the kind of conversations you're talking about. Like, he'll sit down from anybody and say, tell me what's in your head. I want to hear, right? Yeah. And that the legacy media can't find a way, even in their own economic self-interest, to begin to model that slightly, just tells us how
they have to only destroy them, just deplatform him. They just destroy as opposed to grow, you know? They have to pull everybody down instead of rather than elevating themselves. By the way, I have to ask you guys, what are they saying about the Ukraine war at this time?
Russia's losing. Don't pay no attention to that map where the red mark keeps moving to the west, but they're capturing a whole lot of territory with that losing. It's constant Russia loss porn. That's all I read. Clifton?
It's very, very strange to watch. I will say, kind of going back to what Chris was saying, because he actually hit on what I was going to respond with earlier on, just in terms of the point about our leadership class and that kind of a culture, and we're watching the breakdown of all of these systems. I think that if there is a silver lining to all of it, it's that I think a lot of veils have been lifted for people. A lot of people are talking about these kinds of issues and problems, even in an electoral sense. I mean, I wrote down, the magic word, which is Trump, and he definitely has his critics, and how much is he part of the machine, how much is he against the machine, but I think it is remarkable that he steamrolled over all these Republicans who didn't want him. The party didn't want him at first. The party machine didn't want him, and then he steamrolled over Hillary Clinton, who everyone thought was a shoo-in. He maintained a higher level of approval than Joe Biden has managed to do, even though Joe Biden is the beneficiary of all of this sort of hagiographic press coverage. Meanwhile, Trump was demonized all the time. And I'm not saying that he's the end all be all. I'm not saying that the problems that we have can be fixed electorally, but I do think that there is I think one thing that he did inspire is this idea that you can be against the establishment, and that feeds into the popularity of figures like Joe Rogan, who are sort of, they're popular, but they're outside of the system, and they're transmitting information. They're putting people in touch with one another and exposing people to ideas that frankly the reality cartel and their arm in the press apparatus don't want us to hear. So you see we're in an election season right now. There are certain candidates that are winning who are endorsed by Trump. I think the sort of, and the harder they push to go back to the Palpatine speech, they keep pushing, probably because the whatever the Trump phenomenon is having an impact. Gotcha. No, and it's not necessarily about whether or not the Republicans are right or wrong. I think there's a spirit of pushing back against bullshit, and of pushing back against whatever the establishment is. And I think at the same time, there's a paradigm shift where you see, I think because we're in the era where we can see a bunch of quote unquote marginal figures, we can look at people in their bedrooms and it's in their bathrooms pontificating on any kind of things. We interact with normal people, and we see their views and opinions in a way that we didn't, 15, 20 years ago. And I think that is helping to help people, as you said, Chris, see through bullshit, because we're looking at what's happening in this sphere over here with the press and what these politicians are saying, but then we are checking in with ourselves and saying, like, hold on, what they're talking about doesn't jive with what we are seeing, and I think that they're lying to us. So the glimmer of hope is that maybe the result of all of this is that more and more people will stand up and say, no, we're not doing this. And as you say, Chris, because they're trying to control the uncontrollable, which is the uncontrollable is the defiant sort of human spirit, which will somehow find a way to rise up and somehow find a way to break through.
Yeah, I agree. And to me, the common theme here is that I trust people. That's why I do what I do. I just gather data and I put it out there with precious little opinion wrapped around it, because I trust you, everybody, to make of it what they will. Whoever they are in this story, they fundamentally don't trust people. Like, I can hear their thought processes. Like, we can't give people the full information about this magic juice because it might confuse them, or, they just have to lie as almost as a first instinct, because they fundamentally don't trust you to make the right decision. They can make the right decisions, but they don't trust you. So I think that's the great divide for me, is there are people who fundamentally trust the collective, the power structure has the authority, and there are other people who trust the individuals to know what's best for them in their own lives. I'm definitely on that camp.
Well, it goes back to the economist Thomas Sowell has just it's a political book, and he's trying to break down these sort of competing ideologies. He calls them visions of the world. But in order to understand, it illuminates so much how what the divide is, the ideological divide over the pandemic. So he basically talks about how two competing visions of the world. One is the restrained vision of life. One is the unrestrained or unconstrained vision of life. And those who have the constrained vision, they share a more tragic view of the human condition, which is, people are flawed and they act in their own self-interest, and there's not really much you can do about that. So whatever policies you implement need to bear that in mind. Whereas the unconstrained view is, the more liberal view is that, people are perfectible, and, and key to the vision, or also known as the vision of the anointed, is that they sort of really revered these concentrated bits of knowledge in a few people, and to disseminate that knowledge, because they have a different version of what knowledge is and what knowledge is valuable and what the best way to transmit that knowledge is, as opposed to people with the constrained vision, who believe in an evolutionary process of acquiring knowledge, through millions of people over time, and the experience of the many and the knowledge of the many outweighs the specialized knowledge of the few. So, we have people with two fundamentally different ways of viewing the world. And what I've noticed is that the people who are, actually working regular jobs, they're interacting with life on a day-to-day basis, they're blue collar, they're more working class, they were able to sniff out the nonsense much more quickly than a sort of unconstrained anointed class, who sort of separated, they're in their cubicles or whatever on their laptops, and they're at home, and they just say, we're going to trust the science and follow the experts because those people know more than me. It's such a fascinating way to view how everything is unfolded. It puts a framework, and it frames everything in such a fascinating way. But just goes back to this idea, Chris, of people just saying, we're going to abdicate all of our thinking to, this clergy, basically, who knows better than I do. We're going to follow everything that they say, and but hopefully we have more disruptive figures now, who, marginal though we may be, who are able to break through all that noise.
That's so well said.
Yeah, what I find remarkable is this obsession with expertise, of being credentialed expert.
Right.
I was once talking to a lawyer, and I was talking about a guitar player called John Frusciante. He plays for Red Hot Chili Peppers, and he's an astonishing musician. I mean, truly a remarkable guitar player. And he asked me, where did he study guitar? And I'm like, he didn't. He just learned it. He practiced 8 hours a day. I mean, you don't need a degree to be a great guitar player. You know what I mean? But that was his sort of like his go-to thing. Like, what credentials does he have to make him good? And I found that really remarkable, because it was sort of like, he can't be good if he doesn't have a credential, or if somebody with a credential does not say that he's good. Those are the only two possibilities. And I thought that was just bizarre. But it goes to your point, Clifton, the anointed, the credentialed, and the hoi polloi. and the hoi polloi, us working stiffs, we actually know shit. We can tell when something's good and when something's bad. But the anointed class is like, if you don't have the right degree, then you're not good. Chris, am I right? Well, you got a bunch of degrees, so you would know about that situation.
Well, it goes back to this idea that once you've bought into a pattern of thinking, there's a dogma and an orthodoxy around it that if you depart from that, you will get excommunicated from that line of thinking, right? So I get this all the time. It's what I call the public-private conversation. So the public conversation, I was working at the UN for a little while with some people on sustainability issues and energy and all that. Mm-hmm. Publicly, like, these people are the most measured political animals, just all that. Privately, they were saying, hey, Chris, do you think what kind of chickens should I get, and how far out into the country should I move? Right. So I saw this over and over again, but I got to say, based on what Clifton was saying, I actually feel bad for the people who are caught in that unconstrained worldview, because they do believe in this sort of human perfection, and that we can all be perfect as long as we listen to the right authorities and buy into the right points of view and say the right statements in the right order. And the reason I have such compassion for them is that it's such an untenable place to live, because you are only one misstatement away from being excommunicated from the fold. Right.
Yeah.
There's a really awesome piece of work that Miss Leibowitz wrote. I'm looking at it here. It's called The Turn. And she describes being in Manhattan. And, if you're part of the liberal orthodoxy, you get invited to these exciting parties. You might be seated next to, Salman Rushdie. But in order to maintain your good graces, you had to be perfect. And if you slipped up once, you're gone. Right. Yeah. Whereas on the constrained view, like, these are people who might go to church and stand up and declare proudly and loudly that they are a sinner, even though they're not really confessing to anything necessarily, because they understand that the human condition is messy, that we learn, that we make mistakes. But we now live in this world where a tweet you made as a 17-year-old might derail you as a 30-year-old comedian, right?
Yeah.
You have to be perfect from the get-go. I know young men who won't date in college because they're like, I'm investing $250,000 in this degree. I could have some girl decide 6 months after the fact, through some fumbly half drunk where we're both, not in our best. Anyway, you can get in trouble just with an accusation.
Yeah.
Right. And I consider you can be destroyed. So that's what these poor people in the unconstrained view have to live with, is this idea that you are only one error away from being destroyed, even if that error was a decade or more ago. That's that level of, there's like a fear that you have to sort of navigate and live with. And I consider living around corrosive, pervasive fear to be something I'm not at all interested in. But these people are caught in it,
Yeah.
I call it shady.
Yeah, and also it foments an extreme conservatism, not in the political sense, but in a sense of unwillingness to take any kind of risk.
Right.
Because you're like, no, I'm not going to risk it. It's too dangerous. And so they live miserable lives because they're so risk averse. And it's just tragic. Sorry, Clifton, go ahead. You were going to say?
I was going to say, I call it the reverse matrix. Maybe the anti-matrix is a better way to put it. But you know how in the film, at least, you're in the matrix, you get to eat your steak, you get to drink your wine, everything is as normal, and you're completely insulated from the horror of the true reality. But it seems like these people who are in the matrix right now, they're losing their fucking minds like all the time. Yeah. And everyone else on the outside in the real world is like, things aren't perfect, but they're okay. They could be better, but I think we'll be okay. If we can figure this out. But people who are inside the matrix, life is supposed to be better in there, but they're going insane.
They're miserable. Yeah. They're deadly afraid. Like every cough is a death sentence. Like they have this outside sense of like, I'm just one bad doorknob away from catching this thing that's going to kill me, right?
It's sort of like it's not even a medical hypochondria. It's kind of like a moral hypochondria.
That too.
Yeah, well said. Like a terror of just the wrong misstep, and constantly second guessing yourself, because that's something else too that I noticed, that people now, they second guess themselves and they go on and on and on as to whether they did the right thing or wrong thing. I mean, they're so worried about the consequences. It's just, it's just sad because it makes for a small people, a small in the sense of just morally small, and unwillingness to grab life, live life, enjoy life, try to get the best that you can, and a terror at failing. And only through failure can you achieve anything. Only through failure can you learn and grow. I've been fortunate enough to have great successes, and I've also had great failures. I learned nothing from my successes, because when you succeed at something, everything went well, everything worked out. But when you fail, that's when you truly learn. But this horror and fear of failing, and therefore not trying so as to not fail, you never learn. It's only by failing, by going splat on the sidewalk, that you learn to ride the bike. You know what I mean? But they're terrified of that.
I think what's interesting too is it kind of brings it to bring the conversation not quite full circle, but maybe close to it, is this that fear of failure, that fear of taking risks, that leads to mass conformity. And that's why I think you see these people, and I call them the blue church, the blue cult, whatever you want to call it. They're far more likely to fall in line with these ridiculous policies. And it's funny because you mentioned them being worried about consequences, and yet they were so compromised by their fear that they weren't able to entertain the consequences of dramatically locking everything down for 2 years, or putting their kids in masks, or recommending a mass inoculation program right in the throes of the spread of this virus. It's so fascinating to watch.
Well, by submitting to those small fears, you guarantee the larger failure. Right. Yeah. And to your point, Gonzalo, like if I sit here second guessing and worried about this, and so I'm afraid to speak my local truth, such as it is today, and don't give myself permission to have a different truth later in life when I know more, right? By self-limiting that way, I guarantee I never get to my larger truth. Right. Yeah. And then you get to have that horrible moment, as philosopher Stephen Jenkinson, who did a lot of work on he wrote a brilliant book called Die Wise, and he was in the death trade. He sat at a lot of hospice beds helping people navigate that territory. And this documentarian asked him one time, "Oh, so after 1,000, you must have learned a way to make the dying easier." And he just looks right at the camera and said, "Oh no, it's horrible." Not the process. We know how to palliatively manage that. But he said people get to this moment in life where they realize this thing they always somehow thought they were going to avoid is now upon them. And they look back and they realize they wasted their whole life. And he said, there's no way to sugarcoat it. That's a horrible moment. Right. And so that's, to me, the greatest crime, besides the fact that they're boring, of this whole woke culture, is they're actually asking people not to live.
Yes.
And the one life that they have, they're saying, don't live into it. Subvert whatever your truth is to this larger thing, which guarantees you aren't living your life, right? That's a criminal sin, as far as I'm concerned. Sin meaning to miss the mark, right? That's really missing the whole point of life. And so that's, get woke, go broke. I can't wait for it to go broke faster, because it's really, it's just not life affirming. It's not fun. It's not joyous.
Well, that's been a constant theme in a lot of my conversations. I mean, on my podcast, it's very arts focused and arts centered, but we've all been converging around this idea of there is the art that we consume, the art that our culture is producing right now, the entertainment, it's largely void of any kind of spirit or vitality, because it's being made by people who are ultimately very cynical and very nihilistic. Mm-hmm. And they don't, and they don't value life and experience and sensuality, or even sentience, the way that we do. And and I think a lot of people really sense it. They're like, something's kind of off. I mean, I keep using the example because it's such a popular example of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where they, I think people, are kind of missing the point sometimes. But it's not that people fell in love with all the action and the pew pew and the CGI, although that's part of it. Obviously, it's part of the spectacle. We were seduced by who the people under the costumes are, and the human sort of motivations that drive them. That's what Disney figured out, and that's why they made billions of dollars on these movies. But now you see they've abandoned that, and they're only trying to check some boxes in order to win points with their quote unquote progressive peers, and sort of hit these markers. And people are rejecting it because they don't recognize what's on the screen in front of them, because there's nothing that they can relate to. And it's just a funny thing that we've lost this idea of wanting to embrace life, as we're talking about, because you have to embrace the ugliness as well. And part of political correctness is stifling or refusing to accept certain harsh realities of life and humanity in the service of some sort of higher moral ideal. But it just leads to a bunch of truth obscuring. Avoiding, in the short term and over the long term. And I've called this the same thing over and over again. It's the erosion of the soul. I'm in rooms with all these artists who are just, who think like I do, but they're just kind of dead behind the eyes because they're terrified of expressing themselves, and they can't do it. And yet everyone else, it's sort of pushing back on what you were saying a little bit, Chris, about people being able to live their truth. Certain people of a certain ideology can live in a very narrow lane of their particular truth. Yeah. And anyone who steps outside of that is meant to be excoriated or excommunicated. But but as soon as the people who live outside that, they shut themselves off, and there's a piece of themselves. The irony is, as an artist, if you cut yourself off in life, then your art's going to be similarly inhibited. And so it's just a broader point about the lack of humanity, the lack of even soul, which is not a word I would have used, prior to the pandemic. There's just something really missing about all of this. And like you said, Chris, I hope the faster it burns down, the faster that we can rebuild. But I do think people are seeing it now. Even the artists I'm talking to, we're talking about it as well, and saying, what can we do to mitigate all of this, because our ultimate goal is to serve the people, and people aren't being served right now by the people who are in charge of the art and the entertainment and the culture. So what can we do to contribute? It's just, that's my rant.
Yeah, because I came from I started my career in Hollywood, but I really came into my own by writing novels. And what I notice is that the novelists now who are being published are people who all got their degrees, the so-called literary novelists. All got their degrees at some writer's workshop, some MFA program, which is absurd, okay? Because you see, writing, and I can tell you this as a professional writer, that the way to get good at writing is just to do it, to do a lot of it. It's like carpentry. It's a craft that you have to practice, and you practice it long enough and with enough discipline, and you'll get good at it. Going to some workshop or whatever, you're going to wind up writing the way your professor wants you to write, and because that's how you'll succeed and get your MFA degree, which you've spent so much money on, or more likely you've gone into so much debt to get this stupid degree, and so you're going to do exactly what the professor tells you to do, and so you're not going to develop your own vision. You're going to just be copying the dictates of somebody else. And so, and of course, what happens is that inevitably the people who are teaching at these workshops, they couldn't make it as writers. They couldn't. Their material was not particularly good or popular, and so they are teaching. And so it's basically you are copying mediocrities. And so what kind of work are you going to produce? Mediocre work. And the people who are admitted to these programs are not people who have a freshness of vision, or they're just, like you said, box tickers. And so the literature has been stagnant for decades now. There hasn't been any serious novel of any worth for quite some time. Offhand, I can't recall of anything in the last 30 years. In film, the same thing has happened, because all of a sudden, all the filmmakers are these graduates of film school, and they don't have any kind of fresh vision. They only think about movies as opposed to having real world experience that they bring to the movies. You see, so it becomes like a sealed loop. The arts are not progressing. At least the established arts are not progressing. And like, for instance, the art, the arts, the painting, the plastic arts, that became a money laundering scheme in the 80s. I saw it up close and personal in the 90s. It's really a money laundering scheme. Okay, and on all the arts that are created, that are sold for millions of dollars, some of them, it's not because these pieces of art have any kind of inherent worth. It's rather, it's a financial move. And so all of the arts in the West have become completely stagnant. And it's only on the margins that you're seeing some interesting work appear. But of course, the establishment goes out of its way to crush it, to just eliminate it. And it's sort of like, you know, it's like a suicidal culture. I don't quite understand it. I mean, Clifton, have you've seen something? You were nodding along and agreeing with what I was saying. You're seeing the same insofar as the performing arts, I take it.
Even in so I went to a fancy conservatory. Even now I hear they were talking about, you know, decolonizing the program, so to speak. But now you can't even, like, when I went to school, you know, they wanted to train what they called a woman named Zelda Fitzchandler. She wanted to train what we call transformational actors. It's fun for an audience to see people play different, to see the same person play different kinds of roles, and that's the kind of, you know, actors that they wanted to train. But now you can't even say that, because why? It's offensive to certain sexual minorities. So there's you know, I wish I was making this up. There's a video on YouTube where this guy was going around Washington Square Park in Lower Manhattan, which is right near where the Tisch School is. And I recognize some of these kids in this video, you know, as students in this conservatory program. And this interviewer just says, well, you know, men and women are different. And this girl begins to break down crying, and the guys like kind of come in and say, hey man, you know, back off. And I'm thinking to myself, why would I want to work with any of these fucking kids? Why would I want to work with any of these people where they're so rigid? And, you know, again, they've had to cut off entire parts of themselves to express themselves because of some ideology. So those are the kinds of people that you'll be seeing when you go to plays, when you go to movies on screen, kind of devoid of, you know, soul and spirit. And from a writing perspective, I mean, you know, I turned down so many auditions and so many roles because it was just a bunch of, you know, I was just basically a mouthpiece for a bunch of progressive social justice nonsense, which I didn't want to be a part of. And you know, and I can see, you know, I'm like, this show's not gonna succeed. I mean, I'll get a paycheck out of it, but it's, you know, it's gonna fail. And of course, these projects always fail, and people reject them. But what the machine does is that when such a show fails, you're seeing it happen with Lord of the Rings and She-Hulk right now. They say, well, you know, they're review bombing us. It's a toxic fandom. They're all bigots and racists, and they hate everyone. It's not that what we're putting out is trash. So there's a complete lack of accountability made by people who don't have the capacity to improve, really, because they don't want to accept the feedback. But they're so arrogant because they think they're on this crusade for social justice, progressivism, yada yada yada. So you can't really tell them anything. But you know, it just goes back to what you were saying. You know, this sort of worldview has permeated so many things, and it just destroys everything that it touches. And you know, I think of I don't see anything of worth being produced by our great writers or playwrights or screenwriters that's going to have any lasting any staying power the way that a Shakespeare has, or a Chekhov, or, you know, or the Greek masters. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I very well said. By the way, it makes me think of The Onion has gone downhill just enormously, and Babylon Bee cracks me up all the time now because,
right,
you know, I consider The Onion's just woke now, and they're so woke they make really lame, tepid. They're not really jokes anymore, you know.
Yeah.
Just it's like I hate to do this, but I have a hard stop at 11.
Yeah,
which
no, I'm
because
going to
I got
wind
a
it
call
down.
coming in.
Yeah, because it's been a delightful conversation, and we should really do it again. And I hope to have you both on in subsequent roundtables, because it's just been a real delight. And so, before I get going, is there any thought that you have that you want to leave the audience? I should have prepped you before. And you know, ask you to have something like a final thought. If there's one thing that you want to leave the audience with, if I may be so bold, what's your final thought to send the chat on its way?
Find your tribe. Find your tribe. Yeah, I'm that guy. Hell and brimstone is on the way. No, there's some serious hard times coming, and we're going to need each other in ways that are well outside of our normal, potentially, you know, it's slightly disconnected, isolated. I almost sort of know a few people thing. We're going to need each other. And I know that wouldn't be a surprise maybe to you in Kharkov, right? yeah. So that's it. Find your tribe.
Well, I suppose that I would piggyback off of that. A lot of my conversations have been about, awe and beauty and transcendence, and really sort of how the arts can create a sort of divine experience. But the point is, part of the conversations that we're having right now is about how, because these hard times are coming, beauty and inspiration and life affirmation are going to be, extraordinarily important. So, just try to. I think I want to start introducing a little tagline of, make things beautiful and/or make beautiful things, and and share them if you can. It might sound sort of hippy dippy. It might sound kind of sentimental and sugary, but at the same time, what's the alternative? Do we want to keep on sinking into a pit of despair and demoralization, or do we want to try and rebuild from the ashes? And I think we can do that if we focus on maybe some of the brighter aspects of life.
Yeah. My thoughts
and more meaningful aspects of life.
Yeah. My thinking is that, it might be that we're getting to the cliff and we're going to go off the cliff and the whole thing is going to go splat at the bottom. But that might actually be a good thing, because a lot of times, you need to clear the decks. You need to go splat before you can rebuild and regrow and turn into something much sturdier and more honest and with more dignity. And so with that final thought, I'm going to bid you all farewell. Chat, I hope you enjoyed the broadcast, and I'll catch you next time.